All right, welcome back to our podcast. My name's Tiffany Herlin. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and again, I'm interviewing Greg Allred, who is a ACMHC from ThreePeaks Ascent, a short-term nature-based residential treatment program for teenagers 13 to 17 who may qualify for insurance. Please remember that this podcast is not a replacement for therapy. Please always seek a mental health professional for your situation. Thanks for coming back, Greg.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I could have talked to you a lot longer in our last episode. We went pretty long.
Big topic.
I know, right?
Yeah.
So let's try to tie it back in. For our listeners, we talked about the book, The Anxious Generation, and how electronics and smartphones and social media and gaming and pornography is rewiring our children's brains, and we're moving away from a play-based childhood to more of a phone-based childhood, right? And it can cause, I think, our listeners a lot of anxiety as they're like, oh, I've fallen into this, and my kids definitely are struggling with this. So let's give our listeners a little bit of hope with this one.
Perfect.
And you and I off air were talking about some cool things I want to follow back. But for this episode, we're going to dive more into disconnecting to reconnect. How does nature-based therapy differ from traditional talk therapy approach?
So we still utilize the same modalities that we'd utilize in regular talk therapy in any sort of program, but we are immersed in a natural environment. So where the kids live, it's in an area that's surrounded by a lot of nature. We're kind of in the middle of a very large piece of land, so quite a ways away from civilization, so to speak, and it just provides a really great environment to do regular other modalities that we normally would use. So we're using CBT approaches, DBT, EMDR, taking all of the regular approaches that we normally would utilize, but just in that environment. And then also capitalizing on the opportunities that they have surrounding them, because they are in a situation where no one has electronics out there. None of the children do.
They're stripped from electronics.
They're stripped from electronics. It's intended to be a shorter term program. And ultimately they'll be returning home or to another program, moving on to the next step, and at that point that can be reintroduced. But we're in a position where while we utilize the technology for video conference family therapy and phone calls and whatnot, at times the kids don't have those devices.
Yeah, they don't physically get to
Correct.
Carry them and take them with them. So it's a great way to detox and disconnect from their electronics and reconnect back to our mother nature. It sounds like for your specific program and the work you guys do, the kids are taken out of their environment, disconnected. But from my understanding, nature-based therapy can also be done out of office, like outpatient therapy as well, right?
Yeah.
Like it can be done at a park, it can be facilitated. It's basically the idea is that you're getting out of the office.
Correct. Yeah. Utilizing the natural environment it's just a very conducive environment to good mental health and taking some of the distractions and whatnot away and returning to something that's very comfortable, often uncomfortable for individuals if they've been away from it for a while, but very conducive to that. So there's a lot of people that will utilize kind of some of the initial steps if they're, let's say they're experiencing anxiety, and a really good way to kind of implement nature-based therapy initially would be some exposure therapy. Exposure therapy is simply exposing somebody to their fears in a very controlled and systematic manner, and so if somebody experiences anxiety in an outdoor environment, go to a place that's close by, a park that's nearby one's home, and go from there and experience that. Sit with yourself for a little bit without your technology. So that's a good way to start.
That is a great place to start. It can be as simple as just going down to the park that's down the street, or as further along as going actually to where you guys are out in the desert of southern Utah and by all the national parks out there, right? Yeah. Let's talk about like what are some of the benefits of you mentioned this off air, but returning home. What do you mean by that?
So, when I think of the natural world for me, and part of this has occurred over many, many years of spending time outside, it is returning home. Now, think about it as a species. Humans have not been indoors as long as we have been outdoors. We spend as a species, we spent most of our time outdoors and engaging in a variety of activities, some recreational, some for survival. But we've become very, very disconnected over the last few decades. Certainly spending much more time indoors and being locked away from nature. And then with moving away from a play-based childhood where we were spending a lot of time growing up, spending time outside, and now we're spending more of our time on technology. Our children are, and as adults, we're spending more time on technology. Being locked away from that, we're just a little more disconnected. And so I think there's a lot of value in returning back to an environment that is our home, the natural environment. There's been countless psychological studies. People are drawn to environments that are natural. So that's one of the reasons why in buildings and in mental health facilities, you'll see lots of pictures of waterfalls and nature and whatnot. We're drawn to that where it helps us feel comfortable, even if we may not feel comfortable in those environments at times because we're not familiar with them or we think about the dangers. But that is our home. That's where we're from. And so returning to that may be difficult at first, which I certainly have seen. But I think people become accustomed to it very quickly and really enjoy it because it's something that they've probably been longing for quite a long time.
Yeah, I definitely found myself when life has gotten hard and I've gone through various trials seeking the outdoors more, going on hikes, exploring the benefit of the world around me. Living in Utah, there's lots of exploring you can do outdoors. And I didn't really get into hiking until I was a little more in my adult life and going through some tough things myself. And it really, like you said, it was unfamiliar at first, but familiar, because it was like, oh, this is where I feel peace. This is where I feel calm. This is where I kind of escape the noise and disconnect and find my inner peace again. And so, there's scientific research on the positive impact of nature on mental health. I actually read a book about nature-based therapy and it was just packed full of so many statistics around this that of just how we need to get back to Mother Nature, how we need to return home because it's positively impacting kids, adults, adolescents, mental health in such a positive way.
I agree.
And I mean, a lot of that research was finding like how spending time outdoors can reduce stress, anxiety, depression, and it fosters this sense of mindfulness and connection with yourself. So, a lot of times when we're going through trials and struggles and mental health issues, we disconnect from our inner world and we focus on the outer world, right? And things are chaotic and out of control and we try to manage it when in reality, it's when we need to turn inwards the most and look inward and hold up that mirror. And that's hard. It's hard to do, but when you're surrounding yourself with nature and mindfulness, it can help you go inward, and it can be really uncomfortable at first.
Absolutely.
A lot of times, like if you're struggling with mental health and anxiety, it's like sitting with yourself for 5 minutes to meditate can be excruciating for some of our patients,
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think technology has been so problematic, because people can always use it as a way to distract from their own personal problems and what's really going on. They don't have to be alone. They don't have to be with the thoughts that are in their head. It's something that can easily go to. And when we're in a position where we actually get away from the technology and break away and go to a natural environment, we're stuck with that, and it can be very uncomfortable. But as you said, once we spend some time there, and once we kind of connect, and we actually start seeing the larger picture, the bigger picture, I think it puts things into perspective, and I know for me, it always helps me get back to a more centered place, where I can actually start to think about how can I break this situation down, and how can I actually approach it and successfully get through it. Yeah,
you're being more conscious and aware and mindful, and taking a more offense versus defense kind of approach to life. Electronics they can be just mind numbing. I mean, they call it doom scrolling for a reason, right? And a lot of times I found myself when, I've gone through hard things or struggled even with anxiety, that it's easy to, reach for your phone and to kind of get lost in that numbness that comes with it, versus sitting with your thoughts and being with yourself. And it's taken me a number of years of practice to really understand meditation and be comfortable with it. I did yoga when I was younger, and I'm like, oh, this is great. And, we did Savasana at the end and did a little meditation, but I remember my thoughts just racing and having a hard time sitting with them. And now 20 minutes isn't enough, and I love it and crave that time. And so if you're a listener and you're like, meditation's hard and being out in nature is hard and away from my phone is hard, that's okay.
Yeah.
That's normal. Our brains actually resist change. They don't like being rewired. They want to do the path of least resistance. They want to numb out. They don't want to feel. Your brain is going to fight you on these things. So when you are struggling with it, know that it's going to be even harder when you ask your kids to do it.
Yeah, that brings up a great point. If it's difficult for us, it's very difficult for the children who have been raised with those devices. It's definitely more wired with them. And think about all the things that they have been taught over the years, as far as what are the dangers of being outside.
Oh yeah.
One thing that I think is interesting when I look at anxiety versus fear. Fear is, actually your response to something that is a real threat. Anxiety is our physical response to things that we think may be a threat.
A perceived threat.
A perceived threat. Yeah, something that we're maybe psyching ourselves out about. Maybe that's not actually a threat. And I know when individuals start entering into a natural environment and spending time, a lot of times, over several decades of interacting with a lot of people who may just be getting into just hiking or spending more time outdoors, they'll bring up all these concerns around all the dangers, and most of those dangers are not the actual dangers. It's actually something very, very benign that they are dismissive of. We got to.
Cougar.
We're worried about the mountain lion, but really what you need to be worried about is staying hydrated and putting on sunscreen and wearing something that covers you so you don't get sun exposure. Those are the real threats, whereas the possibility of encountering some of those other things are not reality. It's not a real threat. And so we're actually anxious over things that are not real.
Yeah, I love talking to students and families that we work with that you are not your thoughts, and just because you think it doesn't make it true, right? And sometimes we can think things like the sky is falling, right? Chicken Little, which invokes same reaction as if the sky were falling and causes anxiety, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean it's reality.
Yeah.
And sometimes we can get lost in our own heads, and not saying that your anxiety isn't real, and not saying that your anxiety isn't valid. It is real. It is valid.
Yep.
Yet helping you distinguish between your thoughts and reality. And that's part of the challenge. You and I were talking in the previous episode about, parents struggling to let their kids struggle, and how hard it is that if they've already been given a smartphone and social media and games and things like that, to take that stuff away and take a step back. Yet there's some really beautiful analogy that I'd love to come back to, that when we allow our kids to struggle, the message we're sending to them is you're capable.
Yes.
I believe in you.
Yep.
If parents jump in to rescue, the message they're sending then is you're not capable. I don't believe it, even though parents don't mean to say that. And they're not trying to say that, but that's really the underlying message they're giving.
Yeah.
You had a really cool analogy about trees that I'd love you to share with the listeners.
Yeah, from a book called Anti-Fragile. Jonathan Haidt refers back to that book in his book, The Anxious Generation. It refers to the Anti-Fragile book. The necessity of having challenge. And he talked about one of the biodome experiments that occurred several years ago. It didn't last very long. They were trying to set up a little environment where everything would be created in that little environment. One of the things they found is that the trees that were growing in the biodome, because they didn't have wind that stressed the trees and pushed it, creating the trees need to form a stronger root system, they would ultimately grow to a point where they would just topple over. And so the same thing can be applied to children. They need to be pushed and challenged to see what their limitations are, to see what their capabilities are. And so that's why allowing kids to really push their limits and not just protect every interaction they have, they learn how to interact in an unsafe world. They learn what they're capable of, and they get through some challenging experiences, and they grow from those. So even if they are going through something that's difficult, we can help them out and help them process that, and there's a number of different ways that support systems can come into play to help them work through that. But they get through those things and they're stronger because of it, and it's one more experience that helps them take on the world.
And that's the beauty of nature-based therapy, is you're allowed to let the environment kind of dictate those challenges, right? So it's not you against the client and that power struggle there. It's now, it's nature and the natural consequences of if you don't put on sunscreen, you get burned. If you don't stay hydrated, you get dehydrated. And so I guess a good question, because there's probably parents listening like, well, that sounds scary. And what if my child gets hurt or injured, or there's a risk? And I mean, I'm going to take it one step further and be like, well, eventually all our kids are going to experience trials, and they are going to get hurt, and whether it's emotionally or physically, at some point in our lives, you will not be there 100% of the time to protect them. So it's not our job to protect. Our job is, you said it so well in the last episode, our job is to teach our children how to navigate the world rather than create the path that's easiest for them.
Are we preparing the path for the child, or preparing the child for the path? And so in our situation, in our program, safety is the utmost concern. If somebody's not safe, then nothing else can occur. And certainly,
So let me stop you. How can you do nature-based therapy while providing a safe and supportive environment?
We do. So the individuals that we're surrounded with, as far as the staff and the therapists and everybody, we do have to keep in mind that safety is absolutely key. It's first and foremost. And so there's a lot of other factors that come into play because we are in a natural environment. We have to take into consideration all these other things that are occurring. And so in the day-to-day life, just the fact that much of the child's day is spent outside and doing a range of activities and whatnot, we have to take those things into consideration. And we do take that very, very seriously, as far as having systems in place to ensure that everybody is staying hydrated and everybody is wearing sunscreen and their hats and if it's a certain temperature, we see certain physical activity and we seek out shade, and during that time we're also teaching the kids the value of that. And I think the kids learn that pretty quickly. Sometimes they give a little pushback, like, I don't need sunscreen, I don't want that. It's like, well, you need it. And then they start realizing, oh, this is valuable, this is helpful, this is how we can spend time out here for long periods of time and be really quite comfortable and successful. And so, but we like to create challenging situations. A lot of the activities that they're participating in are things that they haven't tried out, that they may be nervous about. We sometimes will take kids mountain biking, for example, and I'm always kind of amazed at how many kids, they know how to ride a bike, but they haven't really ridden bikes very much. And to me, when I was a little kid, the bike, once I learned how to ride a bicycle, it was like I was out of there. That was freedom to me. But a lot of kids are nervous about that, and so it's really neat to be able to teach somebody like, hey, this is how this bike operates, and this is how you can operate it safely and do these things safely. The same thing with hiking and doing certain skills, and having a level of safety in there that's implemented, but still be able to do it for a long period of time. And definitely stress my own issues where I've avoided taking precautions. And when kids ask us, why can't we have knives? It's like, this is the reason why. See that little scar I have? I wasn't wearing my protective glove, and I slit my thumb wide open, and try to take our own experiences and how can we help these individuals in this environment so they learn how to feel comfortable in that environment, and ultimately hopefully get to a point where they see that environment as a very supportive and an environment that's conducive to good mental health.
Yeah, I mean, nature is beautiful, and there's so many great things. I mean, I just think I grew up by the beach, and so it's interesting. A lot of things came second nature to me that when I'm teaching my kids, the beach is a resort, and people think of relaxation, but when you really think about even a place like that, like, you still have to wear sunscreen.
Yes.
You still have to watch out for sharp rocks. Let's talk about the rip current. There's a lot of risk, and it can be a tumultuous environment, even though, yes, it's relaxing, but you're not always drinking pina coladas on the beach under an umbrella, right? And so same thing with the mountains and getting outdoors in the desert, helping our kids understand that, yes, there are risks, and it's okay to be in that environment, but here's the things that you can do to stay safe.
Absolutely.
Ask for help. Here's the support that you need. And here's the natural consequences and why we do the things we do to keep ourselves safe, like wear sunscreen. Yeah,
and I think when you had mentioned asking for help, that's one of the things that I think is super important, and I really try to model. One thing I model is, and I learned this at a fairly young age, and it's been supported by some certain experiences where I didn't know something, and I thought for a moment, I'm not going to ask. I don't want to appear foolish, but I'm going to ask, or I'm going to admit when I'm wrong, or I don't know, whatever. It's in those situations, it's always been reinforced to me that, you can learn something, and it's actually best to, you look more foolish when you get called out not knowing something. And so I really try to model, if I don't know something, I'll ask and I'll inquire, and I'll point out when I'm struggling, like, hey, I'm feeling a little burned out. I need to stop and take a break or something like that. So we really encourage that with all the staff, and I certainly try to do that on a regular basis, and pretty vital.
It's so vital. I think that's the best way we can teach our kids, whether you're a therapist or a parent, doesn't matter, aunt, uncle, anyone, time you're an example for kids, is teaching them that it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to say when you're wrong. It's okay to, talk about your mistakes and when you're sorry. Like going back to the beach, that was just part of my growing up. I love being able to talk to my kids. We just went on a beach vacation, and we were out in the ocean, and I remember talking to them about the undertow and, experience I had getting pulled under, and how I didn't go out in the ocean for a year because I was so scared, because I couldn't get up, and it scared me so bad, and to respect nature, and teaching them, like, that was a tough lesson for me to learn, but now I know that I can't go this far, and I know that I won't go in the ocean when it looks this way or there's warnings, and they say that there's an undertow or a rip current, because we actually were going to take our kids surfing, and the guy who was going to teach them was like, oh, we can't go out today because it's going to take you out to Tahiti. You know, we were in Hawaii, and he's like, you're gonna end up on a different island altogether, and so why don't you guys come back in 2 days? And I remember talking to my kids like, yeah, no, we should listen to that because that's a real thing. And so setting that example for our kids is so important. Now, and then as parents, realizing that they may pretend or act like they're not listening or they don't care, but they're listening.
They listen.
They do. You'd be surprised how much they listen and eventually pay attention. There's a lot of sessions I have where they're like, yeah, this one time when this kid said or you said, and it's like, wow, you actually listened to that? Like, I had no idea you were paying attention to that.
Yep.
Can you provide an example of activities or therapy used at ThreePeaks Ascent to help teens disconnect from electronics and engage with nature again?
Yeah, so some of the activities that we utilize on a regular basis is simply utilizing the area and hiking around. We go on field trips. We have access to a very large piece of public land, and there's some really amazing spots. We have areas where there's interesting rocks. We have areas with petroglyphs. And
what, to our listeners who don't know, what is that?
Petroglyphs. Petroglyphs are basically rock carvings, or carvings in the rock. The petroglyphs would be pictures chipped into the rocks, pictographs or paintings left by indigenous people. Sometimes early settlers will leave some art that's often referred to as cowboy art, utilizing the same techniques. Going and exploring some of those areas. It is amazing. A lot of times kids will be dismissive of, I don't want to see that. That's stupid. But you get them up there and they start to crawl around and they start to explore some of those areas. And it's like, wow, this is really cool. I know when we first get kids, it's sometimes difficult for them to not have their technology and to be away from that. They experience some of the withdrawals.
What does that look like? I wanted to touch on that.
One of the withdrawals that I'll point out that I think most people can relate to is if you've ever had a phantom vibration in your phone or in your pocket where you normally keep your phone. If you've ever had that vibration, that's kind of an addictive response if you don't have your phone with you or it's turned off or you don't have service. So that's something. A lot of the kids, they are definitely preoccupied. They're thinking about what they're missing out on. They're very concerned about their friends. My friends don't know where I'm at. They don't know what's going on. I need to talk to them immediately. Things along those lines, that irritability. Sometimes they'll be struggling with the insomnia, another issue that they encounter because they're often accustomed to being up super late at night, go to bed when the sun goes down, and we get up when the sun comes up, and try to get back on a regular sleeping schedule. But that's something that a lot of the kids really struggle with. So those are some of them.
Well, and going back to our book, The Anxious Generation, I mean, he talked a lot about the damage that and the dangerous impacts it has on children's mental health. Like you talked about the social deprivation. So kids are spending more time online and less time face to face. So I bet you probably see kids struggle socially as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I've seen that in different environments. So in the environment that we have where the phones are completely taken away, kids don't have that crutch that they have had in the past when they're uncomfortable and they can just go to their phone. So sometimes they isolate initially, don't really know how to strike up a conversation, or very awkward. In settings where I have worked with kids who are experiencing the reintroduction of technology, I've had conversations with individuals where they have expressed that when they feel socially awkward, they'll resort to using their phone. And
I think we're all, we can all say we've done that
before.
It's like, I got a voice message or a text.
I got to check my emails and I just don't know what's going on. And we'll talk about the fact that, so they use that to avoid the situation, avoid the uncomfortability of approaching somebody and striking up a conversation. But then I also try to point out, what kind of message are you sending to everybody around you when you're sitting there on your phone? It's like, well, I'm probably sending the message that I don't want to interact with anybody, or that I'm tied up or I'm busy. It's like, yeah. And then you're shocked that nobody approaches you. And when they start realizing, like, oh, I'm sending the message, and they start taking some ownership of how they're interacting. But yeah, learning how to put those things down and how to strike up a conversation, try to model it. Again, going back to that modeling aspect, try to model it at any given time of striking up conversations with people I don't know or don't interact with much, and hopefully encourage that.
You're able to work through some of these challenges that these kids are having with being hooked on their electronics. So we've talked about the social deprivation. You mentioned the sleep deprivation. I mean, that's real, because lack of sleep leads to, we know, depression, anxiety, irritability, cognitive deficits, poor learning, lower grades, and there's long-term studies that have proven smartphones are making our sleep worse.
Absolutely.
And so you're seeing that also in your therapy and in your program.
So a lot of times it'll take a little bit for the kids to get adjusted to a new sleep schedule, and the fact that they don't have something that they can utilize. A lot of times kids will justify their usage by saying things like, well, when I go to sleep, it helps me to sleep by listening to music or something like that. Yeah. But you can read a book. Yeah. But listening to music, doing something technology based usually is pretty disruptive. But reading a book is actually, if it was like a physically held book.
Well, I'm talking more like reading a book on your phone.
Like that's on a kid. Yeah.
That's a lot of things my kids will say is like, oh, I have a book on my phone that I'm reading to go to sleep.
But the problem is the blue light. Yep. Yeah. So it is different if they have a physical book that they're reading,
sure,
and then they'll fall asleep to that. But the behavior is often justified, but the research doesn't support that that's actually the case. And most likely their behavior the following morning and how late they stayed up doesn't indicate that that's the case.
Yeah. Well, and they're also finding that there's attention fragmentation. So since our phones are constantly interrupting us, it makes our ability to focus severely impaired. So we get a lot of self-induced ADHD, so to speak.
Yeah, we're constantly getting these buzzers and bells and notifications from other directions. So we start going down a certain path, and then we get distracted and take these little side routes.
Yeah.
And we're constantly doing that, where we may start off with good intentions and we're trying to accomplish something. We're trying to look something up, and 35 minutes later, we've found we went down some rabbit hole. There's a belief by a lot of people that they can multitask. And the reality is we do not multitask. We switch task.
I'd like to say it's true, but that we can, but I'm terrible at
it. Well, and
you can't do it.
And when you do what people often refer to as multitasking, I like calling it switch tasking, is we basically find that whatever we're doing, we aren't doing it as quickly. We're not as productive, and then we have a greater amount of errors. And so we can go back and forth, but we're making mistakes along the way, and we're taking a long time.
So how are you seeing that translate, like with kids out at your program disconnected? Are you seeing them struggling with attention and it being fragmented, struggling with being in the moment, meditation? How do they overcome that? Yeah,
I think just over time, it starts to get better because they have fewer distractions. They don't have the things that are pulling them away. When we have, when there's staff out there that are implementing some meditation, we have kids that want to do it. It's one of those things, we are not going to force somebody to do it. I don't want somebody to be forced to do a practice that could be helpful, and that never worked for me. It's like, you didn't really give it a shot.
I know, right?
I don't want it to be a negative thing in their mind, but what we'll usually do is what we often find is that there's a couple of kids that are interested, so they'll do some meditation with the staff, and other kids say, that looks pretty cool, or that seemed to help out. Or I've got a student right now who's practicing some breathing techniques and basically had started doing some box breathing. It's like, wow, that's really helping out with my sleep. And we got him a bunch of other breathing techniques that he could utilize, and it's really neat to see him utilize that and really make that connection of like, oh, these are things that can help improve my sleep hygiene. And it certainly helps that he doesn't have a phone there to distract him. And I know a lot of older people are starting to really identify. I teach a general psychology class at the local university, and one of the big things I bring up with the students is how the phones have affected their lives, and most of the kids at that point are starting to realize, like, man, that's really disrupting my life. And so they start implementing some techniques like leaving the phone in another room when they go to bed and getting off of it an hour beforehand before they try to sleep, things like that. But with the younger kids, it's sometimes they're less motivated, but once they start seeing that it's actually helping and improving to not have that device and all the distractions, then they start getting into it a little bit more, and sometimes they're a little more honest about, oh, these are the problems that I'm encountering.
That's one of the other negative impacts is the addiction piece. We talked about that, slot machine dopamine hit. You've had another better term for it.
Oh, they're utilizing operant conditioning.
Yes, operant conditioning.
The operant conditioning, which has been heavily researched.
Yeah. Variable
rates of positive reinforcement elicit the greatest amount of repetitive behavior.
Yeah. So helping them with a program like yours, they have to break away. Yeah. They probably still have that, as Jonathan talked about in his book, that they're still preoccupied with the thoughts of it. What are my friends doing? Do they know? What am I missing out on? FOMO, things like that. It's real. Kids definitely do struggle with it. Causes a lot of anxiety. But over time, they're rewiring their brain, reconnecting back with nature, finding benefits and other skills to help manage and sitting with their emotions. And do you see kids, I guess, have any like big outbursts or anger or any big behavior, like kind of detox as well? I'm just curious.
I think initially we will sometimes see more of that, like a heightened amount of irritability. Okay. But then it starts to kind of calm down. And many of our students struggle with emotional dysregulation, and so at times they'll have those outbursts, and they have a difficult time really learning how to manage that. And so that's a lot of what we're working on a regular basis, trying to help them implement techniques that they can utilize to manage those things. Like when you start getting dysregulated in the early stages, it's not like all of a sudden, very rarely does something occur where it's just immediate, now I'm dysregulated. It's often a build-up. And so what are some of the things you can implement before you get to that point where you feel like you need to blow up and have that intense reaction? Which
takes you back to just at least getting them aware and mindful that there's triggers and there's a cycle that builds up and leads to that, versus just being in the moment and disconnected, right? Yeah. So really reconnecting the kids back to themselves. Yeah. Can you describe a specific example of how nature-based therapy has helped a teen at ThreePeaks Ascent with their electronic usage?
Yeah, I think, and I can put this back to multiple students that I've worked with who have had significant problems with their consumption of gaming, pornography, social media, once they've actually been away from it for a long period of time. And I've gotten this from multiple students, just this understanding of really what it was like. One thing that I think is important for parents to understand, and we'll often get this report when a student is first coming to us, that they're totally dishonest about the amount of usage they engage in, right?
What? They lied about totally how much dishonest, they're using? Yeah.
And what's interesting is that a lot of times they are lying about it, and they're also sometimes very unaware of how much they're actually consuming. And so one thing that's interesting, if you've ever heard of that term flow, when somebody kind of gets into, like if you're an artist and you get in, you're doing a painting, you get in that state of flow, the same thing occurs in a real negative way. They get totally lost in a video game or whatever it is they're doing, that doom scrolling. And so sometimes when a child breaks away from that, it's like, oh, I was only on there for an hour. And it's like, you were on there for 5. It was all night. Sometimes they are completely unaware of just how long. And so when they actually can break away from it for a long period of time, a time that's long enough is not necessarily a long period of time, just a couple of weeks, they can start to become more realistic about what they've actually experienced, how much time they're actually spending, at what cost. Was it really that important that you spent hundreds of hours on your video game to achieve what? Does that translate into something you can purchase that you can hold in your hand? Do you get a vacation from that? A great achievement? No, it's there, and these companies are setting it up. So it is
coins.
Yeah, it is endless now.
Yeah,
it is endless, and so it'll just keep you invested to continue to do that. And when they can start making that connection, as far as a very specific success story. An individual, and I had mentioned this in the previous one, but an individual who had spent lots and lots and lots of time on TikTok, who really connected with the wilderness, really making that connection of like, that was all just wasted time, and really that realization and just total honesty. And this also ties back into a previous comment you had made about kids are actually absorbing these things, but we don't necessarily see the fruits of it. And that's one challenge with working with adolescents, is that often we don't see these amazing rewards until they're in their mid-20s, their late 20s. And I've been around this long enough where kids will reach out and like, hey, I'm really sorry for this, or thank you for this.
That really helps me,
that, and it's
even
wonderful.
Though I act like I didn't.
Yeah. But it's neat to have a family therapy session where a kid will say something that their parents have said. And this happened multiple sessions with this individual, where they were able to reconnect and actually like connect the pieces that of advice and knowledge and wisdom that their parents had given them. They bring it up in sessions, and I remember mom and dad just looking at each other like, oh my gosh. It is beautiful, and that was really one of my favorite individuals to ever work with, and it was just neat to see how they connected so deeply with it, when it was so foreign to them at first. It's just like, I got to get out of here. I can't, I can't be outside all day long. That's too hard.
Yeah. In regards to what you said of not always being aware of how much you're on your phone, it's interesting because now in some of our phones, especially like the Apple ones, you get alerts at the end of each week of how many hours you've been on your phone. And as an adult, I'm like, oh gosh, I spent that many hours on this app. And it's good that they're having these type of accountability things out now to be more aware of how much we're getting sucked in time-wise. And like you said, wasting. And it's great that helping us become more aware and mindful of those things.
Yeah, and thinking about it from that perspective, if it's surprising to us, I'm confident that it's surprising to some kids when it's actually broken down. And then as mentioned before, it's not just the time online, it's the time thinking about it when they're actually away from it. So it's still preoccupying their minds. They're still thinking about it. There was a really interesting study done many, many years ago about the video game Tetris, which it was a phenomenal video game, one of the best video games, and this is the reason why I'm a great packer. When I pack things in the back of my vehicle, perfect. So it did help me. But if anybody ever played that game for a period of time, there was an interesting study of how people would walk through the grocery store and see the way things fit, and they'd almost like fall into place. And so even back with some rudimentary video games, they were finding how it kind of showed up in their in their day-to-day life, and how they were preoccupied with the game even when they weren't playing it.
Interesting.
With something as simple as that. So imagine the immersive worlds that they're experiencing now, and how does that affect the way they think about the world? And there could be some good, but a lot of bad.
So how can we switch that to them being immersed with nature and reconnecting with themselves?
The real world,
The real world. So that leads me to the question, what are some of the challenges you encounter when introducing teens to nature-based activities?
Initially, just a lot of resistance, and it's just due to being uncomfortable. This is unreasonable, and it is amazing how regular activities such as going on a hike or cooking on a campfire will be met with so much resistance. Like, I can't do this. Nobody does this. It's like, people do this all the time for recreation. Actually, it's a very common thing, and a lot of people really, really enjoy doing it. Myself, when I'm off my shift and I'm not working, that's usually what I'm doing. That's what a lot of our staff are doing. It's what my vacations are consumed with. And so just that initial resistance and the belief this isn't going to help. How will this translate into the real world environment? And when we talk about the real world environment, returning home and having technology and whatnot, so they view a lot of those challenges as not being transferable, so to speak. And so sometimes it takes them a little bit of time to realize the value of doing hard things. By doing hard things, you realize what you're capable of. You push through difficulties. You work through the conflict that you experience on a regular day-to-day basis. Every single thing that you do is challenging, because you have to live within a regular environment. So you're dealing with the sun and the wind and the rain and things like that. And it helps you gain grit. You become a stronger individual, and that translates to returning home and to an unnatural environment, but the environment that they're more comfortable with. And then all of a sudden, the regular challenges that they're faced with, like, oh, here's this book report you have to do, is not so difficult. It's something I can do. It's not that big of a deal.
Yeah, or maybe this negative interaction with a friend is something that you've learned how to. You may never
already navigated it.
Yeah. You may never bow a fire and create a fire from, bow drilling ever again, but that persistence and that grit and learning how to do a hard thing can translate into
100%.
If I can do this, then I can do this other hard thing as well.
Yeah, by learning a primitive skill like that, it's very, very difficult, and it takes a long time. By the time an individual completes it, they've learned how to take feedback and advice from other people. They've learned how to observe what other people are doing who are successful with the skill, and to take their feedback and to implement some of their techniques to deal with frustration. Sometimes, when you're doing something repetitively, sometimes you get blisters on your hands, or the spindle will flip out and hurt your fingers, and it's very frustrating. I have yet to encounter a single individual who gets their first fire who says, that wasn't that big of a deal.
I'm sure it hits that same dopamine that
it's like,
even a bigger level than your phone, right?
Oh, absolutely.
For our listeners who maybe explain what bow drilling might be.
Bow drill fire is a primitive fire making technique. Utilize a piece of wood on the bottom. You have a hole in that wood. You take what's called a spindle, which is a round piece of wood a few inches long that kind of sits in that hole. You put some pressure on top of that spindle with a rock or a piece of wood or a bone or something like that. And meanwhile, you have a bow. So imagine like a piece of willow with some 3mm nylon cord on that. It's wrapped around the spindle. You pull the bow back and forth, pressure on top of the spindle, and it creates some punk. Right? Yeah, so you get some little tiny bits from the spindle or the fireboard or both, depending on what wood is harder, and then that'll kind of create, and then that friction creates heat, which will then heat that up, and then it creates a coal. You can then take that coal, put that in tinder bundle or a nest and blow that into fire. Now, something that's neat about that is the kids that do this, they love it when they actually get their fire. It's very frustrating, and it sometimes takes kids a long time to do it. But once they do it, it's very empowering. Very empowering. We can talk about the fact that there's only a small percentage of the world that knows how to do that. I don't know, maybe 1%, half of 1%. I don't know what it is, but a tiny amount. So even if they're really good at soccer, a lot of people play soccer. A lot of people play football. There's a lot of activities that they do where a lot of people in the world do that and are pretty good. This is something that very few people do, very few people master, and they just did it. And when we think about it from the human race standpoint, fire was a game changer for us. And we could start cooking food and spend less time, worrying about, certain issues because we had this protection with fire, and we could stay up later and pursue things. And it does a lot for us. So
cooks us food.
Pretty cool. That's
awesome. What would you say to parents who are listening who are skeptical about the effectiveness of nature-based therapy? Like, well, I could just send my kid to, go talk to some therapist. Why can't I just do that? Like, what would you say to them if they're...
Well, personally, and just due to my experience, spending a good portion of my life outdoors, and it's what I love, and I've learned so much from the time that I spend outdoors. When I talk about going on a trip with a friend, spending 3 days in the desert, desert time just hits differently. 3 or 4 days out in the desert with a buddy is different than working with somebody for several weeks. What we learn about one another and our interactions and the challenges that we face. I think the opportunities that are present are just phenomenal. Personally, I would recommend some sort of outdoor excursion for every person. I think anybody that's disconnected from the outdoors and are afraid of spending time outdoors could really benefit from it. So I'm a huge fan of just outdoor immersion straight across the board. And I think for individuals, particularly those that are really sucked into the technology problems, having that pretty severe disruption where it's not around them, where other kids aren't using it, and where it's where they now have an environment that they can play in and do some other things and just kind of return to being a kid. I think those are some of the really big benefits of that environment.
And I absolutely agree. There's just something. I've learned more about my friends going on a hike and doing some hard excursion, or even going to the beach or anything that's difficult outside. I've learned more about them than, driving in a car and just talking.
100%.
When we're doing those type of things. And you mentioned off air this piece of awe.
Yes.
What do you mean by this piece of awe that comes with nature-based therapy?
Jonathan Haidt in The Anxious Generation talks about this concept of awe, and it's basically when you're experiencing something that's just vast. He talks about vastness, then it's also just out of our frame of like it's just more than we can really imagine. And so I think about the first time that I saw the Grand Canyon. I was in my late teens. I was going on a backpacking trip to the Grand Canyon, and we arrived there really late, and so we got to the rim. I couldn't really see it, and I can't wait to see it in the morning. And the next morning, walking up to the edge, and just like, wow, this is unreal. I experience it in a number of other settings, in addition to the backpacking. I do a lot of whitewater rafting, spent time on the Colorado River, 3 weeks on a Colorado River trip last November. Same thing, just these rapids are huge, and when you have a 16 or 18 foot boat that's consumed in the trough of waves, anybody that's been out to the ocean surfing, surfing there's nothing that's kicked my butt greater than surfing, and
so many lessons
I can't
learned.
do it. I was a diver for years, and I've done white shark dives and seen huge sharks swim by cages. It's just like, wow, we are surrounded by amazing things, and this is a droplet in an ocean of experience and places, and so awe-inspiring. I
love it. And I mean, I think our listeners can all think of their own piece of awe-inspiring moments. I have a core memory of myself. I went camping at this girls' camp every year, and I remember my last year we slept under the stars, and it was the first time I'd ever slept under the stars. And I just remember talking with my girlfriends late into the night about, the world and our beliefs and what our hopes and dreams were, and just staring up at these skies, realizing like how incredibly small I was, and being in awe of the vast stars in the universe, and just feeling this connection with nature and almost a spirituality as well that was just awe-inspiring, and gets you outside of yourself and your self-centeredness, gets you reconnected, and helps you realize like just how big the world is. Again, just taking, I don't know, just really grounding. I don't know a better word other than it's just really grounding and awe-inspiring. Yeah,
it's neat.
I agree. And the more we can get our kids disconnected from their electronics, know as a listener, if you're, parent, you're thinking, gosh, that sounds really hard. There is hope. There is a way to do it. Jonathan Haidt talks about in his book that if more parents came together and said, we're going to, take a electronics fast, or we're going to do less time online and more time outdoors, the more we can collectively do this as a society, the easier it's going to be. And so finding a program like yours is great, because it's not just one kid who's going out to, back to nature and working with therapists. It's a vast amount of kids, and it's a collective experience, which is powerful and healing.
Yeah. Like what you mentioned there, and on a, early interventions and addressing this is important. And I think one of the things that he had mentioned was getting involved with like the PTA and getting involved with your school and starting to implement some of these ways of removing the phones from the the school environment, and implementing more playtime at home, and work within your communities. Start there with your younger children. We're not too far away from the problem. I mean, it's the problem has not grown to a point where it's totally out of control. We can get back to a better spot. Yeah.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to go find your awe. Go find that moment with your family, your kids. Go disconnect yourself and your kids from electronics, and find those awe-inspiring moments, that just those core memories that we should be creating more of, and reconnect back with nature. And start that example within yourself and your family is a great place to start.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Greg.
Thank you.
So good to talk about nature-based therapy in this article, how we can help kids disconnect from electronics and reconnect with themselves and back with nature. In our next episode, we're going to be talking about when to consider nature-based therapy, and what options there are. Like, maybe if you're listening and you were like, well, we've tried outpatient therapy, we've tried all these therapy and different things, and I still can't get my kid disconnected from their electronics. They're still struggling with their mental health. What is the next step then? How do I find a program like yours? So that's what we're going to be talking about. So stay tuned, listeners.
Sounds good.
Thanks.